Good morning and welcome. My name is Fintan Sly. I'm the Chief Executive of EirGrid. You're all very welcome both in the room and streaming online to this workshop around our future energy scenarios. We launched these energy scenarios at our conference at the end of January, and since then have been looking to get feedback as part of a consultation on what you think of those scenarios. And today is an opportunity, and we're delighted to be doing it, by the way, from our office in Castlebar. And today is an opportunity, I suppose, for us to talk through those scenarios in detail, and in a minute I'll hand you over to Noel and Marie who'll give you some of the detail on it. And I suppose use that to enable you to give us some further feedback on that before the consultation closes. Before I get into it, just to say we have got some feedback around the date for closing of the consultation and some requests to extend that, so we're going to look at doing that just to facilitate you in giving us more comment, and we'll be looking at doing that, and we'll put up some details of that on our website before the weekend in terms of extending that deadline. So in a moment I'll hand you over to Noel. Noel is our project manager for future energy scenarios, and he's going to talk you through in detail the scenarios, how we've gone about developing them, and take you through some of the assumptions underpinning it. Then Marie Hayden, who's the manager of scenario planning, will talk you through the next steps, and we'll also do a Q&A, and we've got a good few questions in online in advance of this, and thank you very much for those, and Marie will address those, and then any questions as well that are in the room, we're happy to deal with them. And as I say, if there's anything else that you want to engage with us on about this, look, we're happy to do it outside of this forum as well. This is just an opportunity, I think, for us in the first instance to give you some information to enable that conversation to happen in a very open way. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Noel Caniff. As I say, Noel is our project manager for future energy scenarios. He's got a slide deck here, and he's going to take you through some of the detail around those scenarios. So Noel, thank you.
Thanks very much, Fintan. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Noel Caniff, and as Fintan said, today I'm going to take you through some of the purposes of why we're introducing scenario planning into EirGrid, the assumptions around how we've made our Tomorrow's Energy Scenarios consultation document, and then just getting into some of the detail on some of the questions which people have submitted as well. So just to bring you back to, I suppose, the very first principles on how we actually plan the power system. So when we look at looking at the power system out into the future and how the future usage of the grid in particular might change, we have our grid development strategy, and our grid development strategy sets out the principles for how we will plan our network. So in our latest grid development strategy, which takes over from Grid 25, we published it earlier on this year, and we set out 3 core strategy statements which are in the document. So the first of these statements is that we will have more open and inclusive consultation with stakeholders. We will maximise the use of the existing network where possible, and we will consider further technology options for much longer in our grid development process than we have previously. Our second document, which then feeds into how we assess the future of the power system, is our Have Your Say document. And this document really sets out how we carry out stakeholder engagement throughout the entire grid development process. So right from identifying the future needs of the electricity system, all the way through identifying technology options, and then right through to actually constructing and energising a project. So when we have our core principles on how we actually plan the power system, and we have our input from external stakeholders, we can come up with how we believe the future usage of the grid will evolve over time. So that's looking at your generation, looking at your demand, seeing what impact it'll have on the system. So how will consumers change how they use energy, and then what will that mean for the existing power system? So when we have that, we then look at the electricity system of today, and we look at, can it handle the usage of tomorrow? So can it handle those different changing patterns, that new demand, that new generation? And then we assess the existing system for any issues or risks which might come from looking at that. And we really get to understand those issues. So we look at, is it being driven by government policy, for instance, or is it being driven by an industrial customer connecting, or a generator connecting onto the system? And then once we've understood the reasons and we know when they're likely to happen and to what scale, we can then define a project and identify any possible solutions to address those issues. So today we're talking about our Tomorrow's Energy Scenarios consultation, which really focuses on that first bubble, on how will the grid, the usage of it, evolve over time. So when we consider the future, particularly in the electricity sector, we can say things are incredibly uncertain at the moment. So there's a lot of things feeding into it and a lot of challenges that we have as system operators. One of these uncertainties is political uncertainty. So we've seen the impact that Brexit has had, or I suppose we haven't seen the impact that Brexit has had. We know that the United Kingdom are going to be leaving the EU, but the impact that that has on Ireland and on Northern Ireland and on a variety of other measures is still yet to come into fruition. So that's just one uncertainty that we're trying to capture in how we plan the system. The second is linked to that. So we have economic uncertainty over even currency fluctuations or fuel prices. And this is a big impact on, in particular, when we're operating an all-island power system and we're operating an all-island market with two currencies. So how will the balance between euro and sterling add up? How will investment take hold in the future? So the economy really drives things like demand growth, drives investment, investment in new technology, and a whole ream of other things. So the other thing that we're looking into is societal uncertainty. So we've seen in general there's been opposition to energy infrastructure in Ireland. So not only in the form of the electricity grid, but also in the form of things like renewable generation from wind or even conventional generation like our incinerator plant in Poolbeg in Dublin. So that's a challenge for us in the future and what that will mean for how the grid will evolve. But on the other side of societal uncertainty, we've seen how new devices are really taken off at a much faster rate than ever before. So nowadays, everyone in this room, and no doubt everybody looking online, has a mobile phone in their pockets. 20 years ago, that would have been unheard of. So we have to really consider what are the new technologies coming along in the future and how will that impact on the usage of the grid. And that brings me on to technology in general, and in particular in relation to power systems. So if we take how technology is evolving, we're looking at the future of solar PV, for instance. We've seen the price of PV panels drop significantly over the past 30, 20 years. This will continue into the future, but at what rate will this continue, and how will that impact on the development of solar on the system? We're looking at what the future of fossil fuel generation is going to be. So we're looking at future EU emissions directives policies. Are fossil fuel generation plants likely to close? What will government incentives do to that? What will the future carbon be in relation to that? Then looking at storage on the system. So we have a picture of Turlock Hill here, which is a typical pumped hydro storage plant. So we're very comfortable, very familiar with operating that type of storage. But when we bring that in then with smart meters and with consumers having a view of how their usage is how their electricity is being used, and the future of battery storage in the homes, we have to consider how will storage affect the grid in that way. Will it be tied in with household solar? Will it be tied in with local community energy projects? So these are some of the uncertainties which we're trying to capture in our scenarios and in the future development of the grid. So we're trying to bring these uncertainties in line with things that we have quite a good handle on what the likelihood of, say, expected length of life of fossil fuel plants are, of our wind generation sites. We have approximations for what the demand is going to look like in the future with energy efficiency levels, with economic forecasts from people like the ESRI. And we have quite a good grasp on energy policy up until maybe 2020, but looking out to 2030, it's a bit more uncertain. So what we're trying to do is bring all these factors into how we plan the power system. And we certainly feel that scenario planning is a very good method for doing that. So for anyone who isn't aware of what scenario planning is, it's utilised in high risk investment businesses in general. So it's used in transmission system operators all over the world. It's being used by the National Roads Authority, and it's widely used in the oil and gas industry as well. So it's a means of kind of grouping these uncertainties into certain factors. So if the economy is poor, that will have an impact not only on demand growth, but also on investment or in future technology development. So everything's very linked. So the idea of creating scenarios is that we have very linked and coherent stories that can really shape together. And we are not just considering one of these by themselves, we're really thinking of them as a group that are linked together. So when we decided to do scenario planning or to go about that route, we looked at what factors that we really needed to take into consideration that we ourselves in EirGrid mightn't have expertise in. So we looked at things like national and international energy policy. So looking at 2030 targets in particular. So 2020 targets are very well understood, but 2030 targets are a bit more up in the air. So we have split between the ETS sector and non-ETS sector, which splits essentially ETS in energy, power generation, large aviation or industrial plants, and then non-ETS, which is agriculture, heating, transport. So we have Ireland targets for the non-ETS sector, but in 2030 our targets are a little less well defined in the ETS sector. So that's something that we needed to get more expertise on, and we've certainly consulted with people like the Department of Communications, Climate Action and Environment on that. So that's one of the areas which we are looking to get more info on. Second area then is in relation to the economic developments in the future. So I mentioned earlier on that the impact of currency fluctuations has an impact on fuel prices, also has an impact on interconnector flows between ourselves and Great Britain, or in the future ourselves and potentially continental Europe. We've also seen a trend where electricity demand has historically followed GDP growth very well in the past, going back almost a century. But this link is being broken now due to things like energy efficiency and other methods. Then fuel costs as well. We need to get a view of how the future of gas, coal, carbon will evolve in the future, and what prices and how that will affect our generation portfolio. Next thing then is technology evolution. So how will the likes of household batteries develop? Are they going to get bigger? Will the cost of them come down? Looking at electric vehicles, same thing. Will the batteries in those allow you to travel for longer distances? Will the prices of them come down? Will consumers be more bought into them in general? So we've had a lot of really good discussions with people like the Department of Transport on this method, and a couple of other industry stakeholders as well. Then finally, we've got a couple of other national and international influences, things like environmental planning policy, so looking at future wind planning guidelines, looking at job creation and industrial development. So where is future job creation likely to be? So we've had input from the Department of Jobs, Enterprise Ireland, the IDA on things like that. And then other EU international policies like future interconnection targets, for instance. And then, as I mentioned, transport policy. So how will the future of electric cars really take off? What will be the drivers behind that? And we've got some slides on that later on to perhaps explain that a little better. So when we looked at all of those things together, we looked at who were the best people, who were the experts in the industry that could really help us get information on that. So getting information from these experts is critical to the development of our scenarios. So initially, as you can see here, we've talked to over 40 stakeholder groups up until now, plus the information which we're receiving as part of our consultation, which has been very beneficial. Initially, we started off with government departments and government agencies, and then from there we worked down to people like ESRI to get economic assessments into the future, people like Chambers Ireland to really find out what's happening in local communities, and if there's any local community energy projects, for instance. And we also looked at the energy researchers around Ireland. So we've spoken to UCC, to UCD, and finally then we did a complete assessment of transmission system operators in Europe, in the States, in Australia and New Zealand to find out best practice for scenario planning, so that we could really put our best foot forward when we're introducing scenario planning. So from all of these experts, we've received an enormous amount of information, some of which you'll have seen in our consultation document, and which we're putting out now to get more info from experts in other areas who we haven't spoken to just yet. So when we combined all this information together, we have tomorrow's energy scenarios, which is where our consultation document comes in. So as Fintan mentioned, we introduced the concept of tomorrow's energy scenarios at our annual conference in January, and then we published our consultation document earlier this year in February. And that kicked off our process of gathering further information from people that we haven't spoken to just yet. So our consultation document sets out 4 scenarios looking from 2020 right through to 2040. So we're looking at about close to 25 years into the future, in order for us to help plan the power system and help really find out what's coming down the line, so that we're aware of it and that we're prepared for it. So this publication, just to highlight, it covers Ireland only, and that's one of the questions which we got in, which I think Marie's going to speak about a little more later on. When are we introducing Northern Ireland into this process? So our scenarios are being reviewed and renewed every 2 years. So we will be publishing another version of our scenarios document in 2019, and Northern Ireland will be brought into our consultation process at that point in time. And the purpose of scenario planning is that it's an ever-going conversation. So although we're publishing a document in 2017, we'll be immediately beginning work on our 2019 document, and we hope to continue conversations that we've started in the process of this. So looking at the 4 scenarios, I'll just go through them now a bit more in detail. So our first scenario is steady evolution. So in this scenario, we see quite gradual economic growth. So if you're looking over a 20-year time frame, you're always going to have peaks and troughs. So you're always going to have downturns and high upturns as well. But over time, looking from 2020 out to 2040, you do see gradual growth. This in turn has a number of impacts on the wider economy. So you see further investment in renewable energy. So very much a continuation of what we've seen in Ireland for the past 10, 15 years, where there is investment in things like wind generation, in solar generation, and in other forms of renewable energy over time. We also see that households are beginning to adopt new technologies. So that's not just in things like smart meters and things like smart devices in your home, but also in things like heat pumps and electric vehicles. So that over time, electricity plays a bigger role in how consumers in their daily lives. So the heating and transport sectors in particular begin to utilize electricity much more in this scenario over time. Just some of the highlights there. And this was another question that we received. So these are just highlights that we've pointed out in some of the scenarios. They're just some of the interesting facts that people might see. So for instance, in here, you might see that our 2030 targets are met. Onshore wind generation is increasing, and we do have a new interconnector to Europe by 2025. That's not to say that these things aren't happening in our other scenarios. It's just pointing out some of the interesting facts about this scenario. So looking to a second scenario, which is low carbon living, and this is our version of a gone green. So in this instance, we have quite high economic growth over the life cycle of this scenario. Because of high economic growth, we have a lot of investment and consumer money available, essentially. So there is investment in future technologies, particularly in the case of renewable generation or low carbon electricity generation in this instance. The public are very bought into reducing their own emissions, so very aware of their own footprint, very aware of the impact that their energy usage has on the environment. So in this we see things like carbon prices, things like incentives for low carbon generation coming into play, and it gives us our highest level of renewables on the transmission system out of any scenario. Also in this scenario, you'll have seen that we have our highest level of data centres. And that comes from essentially high economic growth drives investment not just in energy infrastructure, but also in things like transport infrastructure or broadband infrastructure, which are key items for data centres locating in Ireland. And again, we might go into a little more detail on that in our slides in a few minutes. Our third scenario then is slow change, and this is a flip side to low carbon living. So it's where we have slower economic growth, and because of that, investment isn't as widespread. So in general, the economy is very risk averse. So you see people investing in proven technologies and not much adventure in new technology. So in this instance, any investment in renewable generation, for instance, would primarily be in wind generation because it's been proven in Ireland, it's understood and it's widely known. There wouldn't be as much investment in solar generation or in any ocean generation technologies like wind or like wave or tidal or offshore wind generation in this scenario. You might also see that the portfolio of existing generation on our system from fossil fuel plants like coal, peat, gas, there isn't really a change in that over time. So this scenario would see coal generation continue to being utilised past 2030, and it's our only scenario to consider that. Our peat generation plants stay open for much longer in this scenario than in any other scenario too. In other scenarios they can convert to biomass, so that isn't seen in this scenario. Then finally, investment in data centres and in FDI, foreign direct investment in general, slows down in Ireland post 2025 due to the slow economic downturn. So this scenario does not meet energy targets, as you'll have seen. And it's certainly a possibility, and it's something that we have to consider as prudent system operators. So our final scenario then is probably our most extreme scenario. So it's looking at a strong economy, but the differences between low carbon living and this scenario are that the changes on the energy system as a whole are really driven by the actions of consumers. So in this, the consumers themselves want to become as energy aware as possible, as energy efficient. So there's investment in things like electric vehicles and heat pumps at a much earlier point in time than in any other scenario. There would also be quite a high level of household solar PV, so rooftop solar PV in this instance, and that would then be coupled with things like household battery storage, so that you can utilize the solar energy during the day, and then anything stored you can utilize in your home during the night. This has quite a big impact on the usage of the transmission system, because a lot of the demand on the system is being served at the distribution system level or at household level. So not as much of that reaches the transmission system, particularly in the summer months. So this would have a big impact for our model as transmission system operators. So that's a very quick overview of our 4 scenarios, and more information on that can be found in our consultation document and in our appendix document, which goes along with it. But I'm just going to go into maybe a couple of topics and just show you how these things change depending on what scenario, and really the key drivers for the change in these areas. So our first is the demand range. So if you look at the amount of electricity demand required in Ireland today, it's about 28 terawatt hours, give or take. So our scenarios by 2030 predict that this will increase to between 35 and 44 terawatt hours. So that's quite a big demand increase, and we're looking at ranges from close to 30% all the way up to 60%. And the key drivers for that are really things like economic growth, as I've mentioned, energy efficiency levels, things like electrification of heat and transport. So your electric vehicles, your heat pumps in your home, they have a big impact on that. But the biggest impact itself is actually data centres and whether or not they locate in Ireland. Just going into a bit more detail on data centres then. Today on the system we have about 250 NVA of data centres installed on the system. Our scenarios are predicting by 2030 that will increase to between 850 and 1950 MVA. So that's quite a substantial increase. Data centres, just to make you aware, they tend to act as base load, so they're very predictable, very steady. Their energy requirement doesn't really change throughout the year, doesn't really change throughout the day, so their day and night profile tend to be quite equal. They are serving the data needs of people across Europe, the States, around the world, so that doesn't really change depending on time of day. So they do have benefits there for increasing the amount of instantaneous renewables on the system, for instance. Because you have a higher base demand, you can get more renewables onto the system at that point in time. Some key drivers for why data centres want to locate in Ireland, or what will drive them to locate in Ireland, include access to low carbon generation or low carbon power. So being green is seen as quite a driver for data centres in Ireland, and in particular because we do have such a high level of renewable generation on our system. Infrastructure, not just energy infrastructure, but as I mentioned, broadband and transport are key drivers. Reliable electricity supply, so Ireland has quite a reliable electricity supply, so ensuring that power is there constantly is a key driver for them here. And then finally, an educated English-speaking workforce like we have in Ireland, and in particular now that we're also still a member of the European Union, that definitely has some benefits as well. So on to our next topic then, which is electric vehicles. So I mentioned this a bit earlier on. So at the moment we have just over 2,000 electric vehicles on the road in Ireland today. So I believe there was about maybe 400 additional electric vehicles last year in Ireland. By 2030, our scenarios see that increasing to close to 70,000 to almost 300,000. So this is a significant increase compared to 2,000 that we have on our road today. But if you take a step back and if you look at our total vehicle fleet, we're still talking about quite low numbers here, between 3 and 13%. But in order for that to happen and for that shift to take place, we would need a number of things to happen. So some of the things which we've been informed about and which we've got input from experts on, we would need things like improvements in battery technology so that people are more comfortable in driving longer distances. Ireland isn't the biggest country in the world, but it's still important that we can get from Dublin to Galway, Dublin to Cork and back, maybe potentially on one charge. Things like consumer engagement, so people being bought into the idea of giving up their petrol or their diesel cars so that they can take a punt on electric vehicles and start to decarbonise, and that's what you're really seeing in our consumer action scenario, which has close to 300,000 EVs on the road. And then other countries in the EU are introducing some policy or incentive schemes. So you've got in Norway, for instance, they allow people to drive in the bus lanes with electric vehicles or free on-street parking. So these are just some options for what might incentivise people further to go towards electric vehicles. Then we have wind generation. So today's wind generation, the capacity on the system onshore is about 2,800 megawatts. And then offshore, we have one offshore wind farm, which is about 25 megawatts just on the east coast. So the scenarios that we've considered for 2030, and then again based on input that we've received from a wide array of experts in the industry, indicate that that might increase onshore to between 4,600 megawatts and 6,000 megawatts by 2030. So there is a limit to the amount of onshore wind generation which you can get in Ireland, and that's not a system limit, it's not a grid limit, it's based on where's the best areas to build onshore wind generation essentially. So there will come a point in time when we do have to move more wind generation offshore if that is to continue as a technology. So the offshore wind generation we're seeing is it might stay the same or it might increase to about 2,000 megawatts is what we're estimating. So a recent report by the government has said that Ireland has the capability for almost 13,000 megawatts of offshore wind generation off the east coast and in other areas. So there's an awful lot that needs to happen for that to come to fruition. But we've considered up to 2,000 megawatts by 2030 directly connecting into Ireland. That's not to say that more couldn't build and directly connect into Britain or through other areas of interconnection, but that's what we've considered so far. Key factors in future wind generation locating in Ireland include things like wind farms and planning. So we know that at the moment there is a number of wind farms that have connection agreements with ourselves, and that there is wind farms that are in the process of obtaining planning permission. So we do know that there is some in the pipeline at the moment. Then there's future energy policy. So I think Marie might touch on this a little earlier on, but what are the specifics for the future energy targets in Ireland, and what role will wind generation have to play in that? Then we have things like societal acceptance. So the wind farm planning guidelines are under consideration at the moment. Will they be extended, and to what impact will this have then on the future of onshore wind generation and its ability to build in Ireland? And then you're always going to have technology improvements. So wind farms are being able to harness the capacity of wind much more. So we're seeing capacity factors. So the amount of energy you get out of one wind turbine has improved drastically compared to, say, 20 years ago, compared to what you will get today. And we expect that to increase even further then over time. And then the final variable I'm just going to look at today is fossil fuels. So this is quite a wide area. So if you consider today's generation portfolio, an enormous amount of that is made up with fossil fuels. So we have just under 6,500 megawatts of fossil fuels on the system. So by fossil fuels here, I mean coal, gas, peat, distillate oil and heavy fuel oil. So those are the 5 primary fossil fuels which we have on the system today. That will likely change in the future, and there's a number of reasons for that. So in 2030, our scenarios see that figure decreasing by about 1.5 gigawatts or 1,500 megawatts and 2,200 megawatts. And some of the reasons for that is the price of fossil fuels. So how will the price of coal and gas evolve over time? The price of carbon in particular in the future. So the price of carbon is going to continue to increase based on how the EU emissions trading scheme works. So at the moment it's quite low, but that by 2030 it'll be much higher, and then going out to 2040 it'll be incredibly high. We also have things like some fossil fuel generation in Ireland coming towards its end of life based on a technology point of view and just how long it's been in service. So we have quite a lot of old plant in Ireland. We have the quantity of low carbon generation will have an impact on it. So how much wind and solar is actually getting onto the system, how much of it is being generated. That limits the space essentially available for fossil fuels to meet our demand. And then we have a number of things like emissions directives, government policies, which might lead to some fossil fuels moving to a different form of fuel over time. So, for instance, in our scenarios, we have a working assumption that our coal generation plant will convert to a gas plant, depending on the year. So that's a working assumption. There's a lot of options for that. It could convert to a biomass plant. It could convert to a CCS plant. So there are a number of options under consideration there, but our working assumption is it will be a gas plant. So just when you're bringing all these things together then, and when you actually see these variables coming together in coherent scenarios, you can really see the difference on what we've considered between each scenario. So you can see our low carbon living, for instance, has our highest demand, our highest data centres, and that in turn leads to our largest level of onshore wind generation and offshore wind generation with 6,000 and 2,000 megawatts each. However, you see that the fossil fuel generation plant in this scenario is at its lowest point. Looking at the slow change, you see the exact opposite, where because of poor economy or poor investment, you see the demand on the system decreasing. You see onshore wind generation not increasing to as much as it does in other scenarios, and you see our fossil fuel generation staying quite high. And then consumer action, just to show the differences between the uptake in electric vehicles, for instance. We have our highest level of electric vehicles in that scenario, and similarly we have our highest levels of heat pumps in that scenario. So that's just a quick summary of some factors on that. So just to discuss some of the questions which we've got in today about our consultation process, I'm going to hand you over to Marie Hayden, who's the Manager of Scenario Planning in Ireland and in Northern Ireland. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Noel. Thanks. Thank you very much, Noel. Very comprehensive review of the various scenarios. So I only have 2 slides, you'll be glad to hear, and then I'm just going to move on to some of the questions that we received in advance and any questions we have here in the room. I just want to cover very quickly the consultation process. So this slide is already out of date because it shows the consultation ending in 31st of March. But as Fintan said at the beginning, we're going to extend that just to ensure that we're capturing as much input as we possibly can. I think the publicity about this event around Castlebar created awareness in groups who hadn't previously been aware of this consultation, and thank you to those who fed that back. So we're going to extend that timeline, and we'll put up a new timeline on our website once we've had an opportunity to do that. We first launched it in January, and the consultation document was published in February. And with it, there's a set of questions, a link to a way to answer some questions online. And of course, there's an opportunity for free text as well. So we hope people will utilise that opportunity to provide us with input into these scenarios. We would still expect that we'll be closing the consultation during April. And as such, over the period of April and May and possibly into June, we'll be reviewing those submissions and updating our scenarios to reflect the input that we've received, with a view to publishing a final set of scenario documents in the summer of 2017. As Noel mentioned, this is a 2-year cyclic process. It's our first time doing it, so it won't be long after we've published the scenarios that we'll be out consulting again on the next set of scenarios. So just to go on to the consultation process and the feedback we're looking for, I'd just like to explain one thing, because I think in some of the questions we received, it might be worth clarifying. This document is intended to produce a view or state a view of what the future might be out from 2020 out to 2040. It's definitely not a statement of what the future ought to be or what it should be. It's been developed based on talking to people who know a lot about their specific field, whether it's a climate policy group, a wind group, a solar group, or a societal trends group. And that's how we've gathered the information and come up with these scenarios. Not all of the scenarios meet stated policy or political objectives. They are simply just a reflection of what the future might look like. And so when we're getting your scenarios, we're very interested to know your feedback. Do you think we've grouped the scenarios well? Have we linked high economic growth with technology developments? Is that appropriate? Have we missed any key factors in what we've described as affecting the usage of the grid? And do you have any information that we haven't incorporated or we haven't obtained to date in the development of our scenarios? It's been great to meet so many stakeholders during this process, but by no means have we met everybody. So we do hope that this consultation online provides an opportunity to gather that additional feedback. So I'm just going to leave it there on the consultation. I'm going to go back to this slide, which Noel put up, because it's my cheat sheet. I forget sometimes the numbers that apply to all these ranges. So if I do get a question, at least I'll be able to look at it. And I'm going to start with a couple of the questions we received in advance. So we received quite a lot of questions in advance, and thank you very much everybody who took the opportunity to submit the questions. We've grouped the questions into themes, so if the specifics of your questions are not answered, please do follow up with us and we'll come back to you. And also just to say, we did receive a number of questions on very specific grid development projects, and again we're taking those and dealing with them and responding to those individually, and today I'm going to talk about the questions which relate to the scenarios themselves. So just bear with me for 1 second, I have to pull this up here. So one of the questions we received was in relation to the Northern Ireland scenarios, and I think Noel addressed that in his presentation. We're going to start engagement with stakeholders in Northern Ireland later this year, and the next publication will be an all-island document which shows scenarios across the island. The second question I'm going to go to, our theme I suppose, was a question about the infographics, so some of the pictures which accompany the scenarios. And they just asked, why are we only showing the demand in 2 of those scenarios? So again, those infographics pick out the highlights for that scenario, but for each of the scenario, all of the detail required is provided in the appendix. So hopefully you can find all of the information you're looking for in those appendices. If there's anything not there, please do contact us again. And I'll just go to maybe a third theme, I suppose, which came through, which was a question about the link between economic growth and the change in the generation of electricity, or the demand for electricity, and the usage of energy. As Noel said, historically economic growth was very directly coupled with the usage of energy, and even going forward, higher economic growth and activity always tends to involve higher usage of energy. But in these scenarios, we do look at how those energy demands may be met, and they're not all met with the traditional large-scale power station connected to a transmission system. In some of the scenarios, those energy needs are met at a very local or domestic level. So I hope that that link between economic growth and the generation of electricity is clear enough in the scenarios. I think the other thing maybe that Noel pointed out, which is also I think quite relevant in these scenarios and something we've got a lot of positive input and useful input on, is the link between the demand, the growth in demand, and data centres. So whilst we do see some of the demand growth coming from economic activity at a domestic level, a lot of that is offset by energy efficiency. So the majority of the demand growth we see in the future, certainly over the next 10 years, is coming from data centres, which are very large by comparison to the type of demand that you would see at a domestic or community or local level. I might just stop there and see if there's anybody in the room has a question before I go to the last couple of questions I received online.
Larry, I'm with the Department of Climate Action, which would have been the old Department of Energy, and I suppose I know Noel touched on it in his presentation, but from our perspective, one of the key items here is how you go about linking the tomorrow's energy scenarios with energy policy as it's evolving at departmental level. And I suppose I'm asking it particularly in the context of the clean energy package recently published. Yeah. Like, we're just embarked now on a series of negotiations at European level on, I think there's 8 different legislative proposals in that package, plus. So obviously, depending on how those negotiations go, there's going to be a lot of policy changes and so on and so forth. So I'm just interested maybe in exploring a bit more detail. Yeah, how do you go about linking the policy with the scenarios?
Okay, that's a very good question, and I just wanted to check with my AV guys at the back. Will that question have been picked up online, so they'll have heard the question? Okay, very good, thanks. So obviously it's a huge area, right? So policies, climate change and energy is an enormous area and incredibly influential on the usage of the grid. So it's a couple of things I'd like to address. First thing I'd like to say is that we didn't set out for these to generate a set of scenarios that would meet any specific policy objectives. So we generated them based on a building bottom up, if you like, and seeing what the outcome of them was. As you probably know yourself, the policies and the EU policies and targets, if we're going to use that word, on renewable energy are unclear out to 2030. So I think it's well understood that we have a target that 40% of electricity should come from renewable sources by 2020, but beyond 2020 there isn't a hard target set. In these scenarios, obviously, people have asked us, you know, what electricity are we seeing coming from renewable across these scenarios? And if we take 2030 as an example year, we see these different portfolios range from anything from approximately 40% up to as high as 63, 64% of the electricity coming from renewable sources. We do understand that there will be carbon. There's a carbon emissions limit for Europe, if you like, for 2030, and reduction target in particular to reduce by 43% against 2005 levels from this sector. But a lot of the intention is that those limits will be met by economic means, by trading means, by the price of carbon, as well as by specific policy actions. It's not clear whether each member state will get its own specific target like we did in the last package. So what we've done is, where people have asked us, are we hitting targets? We've assumed that 43% as a target for Ireland as a reference point, but we know it isn't a target. There isn't a specific target of 43%. And some of these scenarios achieve that 43% scenario, but certainly the slow change does not. So we haven't constructed them to meet the targets. In many of them, they do meet that level, but the slow change one doesn't. I think just the other aspect of policy, particularly in relation to energy and climate action, people often talk about the subsidising of renewable generation. What we, in developing these scenarios, we have looked at the sort of underlying cost of the different forms of renewable generation, so onshore wind, offshore wind, biomass and solar. And we've used an external reference data, sort of created, if you like, a merit order of what's the cheapest, what's the most expensive. And that has been quite informative in developing these scenarios. So we haven't assumed any subsidies are there, but we've kind of more looked at what is the underlying cost of the technology. Don't know if there's any other questions in relation to that.
I don't know. I'm Alan Lucy, I'm in the planning section of Mayo County Council. I've noted that you mentioned about the offshore potential on the east coast. The government has also indicated there's a significant potential off the west coast. I'm just wondering, have you factored in how the energy developed off the west coast would be transmitted into the transmission system?
So I suppose in constructing these scenarios, the first part of this process is to construct the underlying scenarios, and we haven't done the grid needs assessment that would come with that yet. So when you plug these scenarios into a model which models today's transmission system, you can then see whether the system is strong enough to serve the needs under each scenario, or whether development projects are required. So that's the next step in this process, is to carry out that technical assessment. So I suppose the short answer is no at this particular point in time, but we will be doing those studies later in the year, and we'll be publishing the outcome of those studies as well. If it's all right, I might go back to two of the questions we received as well in advance. I know we're probably running out of time. So we did receive questions about interconnection between Ireland and Europe and the UK and Northern Ireland, and the targets that are set at EU level. And there are some targets set at EU level, and more or less that 10% of your generation capacity should be there should be the equivalent amount of 10% of your generation capacity in interconnectors. And there's an expectation that may rise to 15% by 2030. So in our final document that we publish later in the summer, we'll be more clear about what those targets are and what the interconnection levels are and how they map onto those targets. Interconnection is from a member state level, so it would include our existing interconnector to the UK and the interconnectors to Northern Ireland. We have assumed in these scenarios, and this is not to hit targets, but just based on information received, that at least one additional interconnector will be on the system between Ireland and somewhere else by 2030. It could be the UK or it could be France. So it's an external HVDC interconnector, and that's in the detail in the appendix as well. And the last question I'll take from the online group is kind of, again, it's sort of a theme question. A number of questions came on this and sort of relates to the question just received, as in what are the next steps in terms of technical assessment. So, as I say, we will be publishing our final set of scenarios in summer, and be going straight on to the piece of work then to see how the grid of today performs under those various usage scenarios out to 2030, and whether it does show the need to develop any part of the grid in order to meet those scenarios. One of the great things about scenario planning is that where you see a need, you can really link it to very specific groups of activity and things, and we hope that that will help us track those needs which are likely to happen and those which we have to keep an eye on and may develop into the future. So we look forward to sharing a lot of that information with you in the latter part of this year. And in the meantime, that kind of closes the questions I've received online. I don't know if there's any other questions in the room.
Not a question, but just if you wouldn't mind, Mary, just if I could use this forum to draw attention to a consultation that the department has on its website at the moment. I mentioned the Clean Energy Package. That package is going to be dramatically important in terms of energy policy across the next decade and beyond. So we have an open public consultation on that at the moment on our website. You'll find it on the front page of the department's website.
And roughly when does that run to?
At least for another 3 or 4 weeks.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's great. So that's 2 consultations everybody should be reading and very linked. So no, thank you for raising that awareness. It's great. I think our audience will be very interested in that as well. If that's it, I think we're probably bang on time to wrap up, so I'll close it. I thank you very much to the people who've turned up physically and turned up virtually. I hope you found the session useful. I hope you will provide feedback on our consultation. And if you have any additional questions, please contact us, and of course we'll respond to those as quickly as possible. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.